Hello, dear friends, and welcome to Mild History. Before we begin tonight's journey, I'd love to know, where are you listening from? Perhaps you are curled up in a quiet bedroom, perhaps traveling on a dimly lit bus, or sitting in the stillness of a late evening. Wherever you are, I'm grateful that you've chosen to spend this time here. When we think about sleep today, we imagine something ordinary. A soft bed, perhaps a pillow or two, warm blankets, and the quiet of the night. We close our eyes, drift off, and expect 8 hours of uninterrupted rest. But in Victorian Britain, sleep was a far more complicated experience. It was shaped not only by class and wealth, but by fears, superstitions, and customs that seem unusual to us now. Victorians did not simply lie down and close their eyes. For them, sleep was a ritual, an act surrounded by rules, advice, and constant reminders about morality and health. Doctors, reformers, and writers filled newspapers and pamphlets with instructions on how, when, and where one ought to sleep. Families followed traditions passed down for generations. And while the wealthy enjoyed large bedrooms, feather mattresses, and embroidered linens, the poor often made do with straw, crowded conditions, and restless nights broken by noise and labor. This contrast between comfort and hardship defined Victorian sleep. The middle and upper classes presented sleep as a moral duty, linked to health, discipline, and productivity. But for the working poor, sleep was often brief, irregular, and uncomfortable, stolen between shifts in factories or in overcrowded lodgings. Yet even for the privileged, the night was not free of anxiety. Many Victorians still believed in the danger of night air, the risks of drafts, and the presence of unseen spirits in the darkness. Superstitions shaped bedrooms as much as science. To leave a window open might invite illness. To see a dream of death might foretell tragedy. The line between rest and unease was always thin. The Victorian bedroom itself reveals much. In wealthier homes, it was a private retreat, decorated with heavy curtains, ornate wallpaper, and thick carpets that muffled footsteps. Beds were often the centerpiece, raised high above the floor, surrounded by canopies, and layered with blankets. For the middle and working classes, bedrooms were far simpler, often shared and lacking in privacy. Entire families sometimes slept in a single room, with little more than straw mattresses or hard wooden frames. Sleep also reflected broader cultural ideas. The Victorians lived during the height of the Industrial Revolution, when factories, trains, and gaslights reshaped time itself. Nights were shorter for many, with shifts extending into the small hours. The old rhythm of sunrise and sunset was broken, replaced by the demands of industrial schedules. Sleep was no longer entirely natural. It was managed, disciplined, and often interrupted. Another striking difference lies in the pattern of sleep itself. Many Victorians did not expect to sleep in one long stretch. Instead, they followed what historians call the two sleeps pattern. People would go to bed for a first sleep, wake around midnight for an hour or two, and then return to bed for a second sleep. During the waking interval, they might pray, read, write letters, or even visit neighbors. Night was not a single block of unconsciousness, but a time of waking and sleeping in turns. This segmented rhythm, which seems unusual to us, was normal for them. It shaped how they imagined night, not as a period of stillness, but as a time when life continued quietly in the shadows. Midnight was not only for dreams, but for thought, for intimacy, for reflection. When we imagine the Victorian night, then, we must think not only of rest, but of ritual. We must see the flicker of candles or gas lamps, hear the ticking of clocks, and feel the weight of heavy blankets. We must remember the crowded rooms of the poor and the ornate chambers of the rich. We must recall the fears of drafts, the whispers of ghosts, the advice of doctors, and the endless pursuit of health and morality through proper sleep. Victorian sleep was more than rest. It was a mirror of society itself, divided by class, shaped by science and superstition, and disciplined by the rhythms of work and duty. To lie down at night was never simple. It was to enter a world of rules, anxieties, and customs that tell us much about the age. As we begin this journey through the Victorian night, let us look closely at what it meant to sleep in this era. Each bed, each bedroom, each ritual speaks to us across time. They reveal not only how people rested, but how they lived, feared, and dreamed. This is mild history, quiet, steady, and perhaps a little boring. But in the details of something as ordinary as sleep, we find the pulse of a vanished world. And so, with the lamps dimmed and the curtains drawn, let us step softly into the bedrooms of Victorian Britain and see what it was really like to close one's eyes and drift into the dark. To understand what sleep was really like in the Victorian age, we must first step inside the bedroom itself. Bedrooms in this period were not simply places to rest. They were reflections of class, health, morality, and identity. From the heavy drapery of aristocratic homes to the bare wooden floors of working-class lodgings, the Victorian bedroom tells us almost everything about how people lived and how they dreamed. In wealthier households, the bedroom was a space of privacy and comfort. It was often large, with high ceilings, ornate wallpaper, and thick carpets that muffled footsteps. Heavy curtains covered the windows, both to block out the cold and to keep out prying eyes. The centerpiece was, of course, the bed, usually raised high on carved wooden legs, layered with mattresses, feather beds, and thick blankets. A canopy or tester often hung above, both decorative and practical, keeping in warmth during winter nights. Furniture completed the scene: dressing tables, armoires, and washstands equipped with bowls and jugs for washing. Bedrooms doubled as personal spaces, sometimes even as retreats from the public life of the household. A wealthy Victorian could linger in their bedroom, writing letters, reading by lamplight, or even taking meals in privacy. The space was both intimate and luxurious, designed to cradle sleep in comfort and security. But this was only one side of the story. For the middle class, bedrooms were smaller but still respectable. They reflected values of order, neatness, and modest comfort. A typical middle-class bedroom might feature a sturdy bedstead of iron or wood, a modest set of drawers, a washstand, and perhaps a simple carpet. Walls might be papered in muted colors, and windows draped with functional curtains rather than elaborate brocade. The bed was still the focal point, but it was less about grandeur and more about utility. For the working poor, bedrooms were entirely different. Many lived in cramped lodgings where space was scarce. Entire families often shared a single room, with parents, children, and sometimes even boarders all sleeping in close quarters. Privacy was almost non-existent. Beds, if they existed, might be little more than straw-filled sacks on the floor or rough wooden frames with thin blankets. In some cases, 2 or 3 children would share a single bed, while parents slept in another, or everyone crowded together for warmth. Ventilation was a constant problem. Many Victorian reformers worried about the bad air of poor bedrooms, which were often small, windowless, and unheated. Overcrowding was linked to disease, and reformers wrote anxiously about the dangers of close sleeping arrangements. Yet for many working families, there was no alternative. The bedroom was not a sanctuary, but a crowded space of necessity. Lighting added another layer to the experience of the bedroom. In wealthier homes, gaslight or oil lamps created a warm glow, though fears of gas leaks lingered. In humbler dwellings, candles or rushlights provided dim, flickering illumination. Once the light was extinguished, darkness was profound. Unlike today, when streetlights and electricity banished the night, Victorian bedrooms were deeply shadowed, with only moonlight or faint gaslight seeping in through the curtains. Temperature was another defining factor. Wealthy Victorians piled on blankets, feather beds, and even bed warmers, metal pans filled with hot coals that were passed between the sheets before bedtime. Middle-class families used simpler means, layering blankets and quilts. For the poor, however, the cold was a constant companion. Thin bedding, drafty rooms, and inadequate clothing made winter nights harsh. Accounts described children shivering under threadbare covers, their sleep broken by the chill. Bedrooms also reflected cultural ideas about morality and discipline. Reformers urged families to keep rooms clean and orderly, warning that untidiness led to moral decay. Guides insisted that bedrooms must be well ventilated, modestly furnished, and free of frivolous decoration. Sleep was not only a matter of comfort, but of health and virtue. Another striking feature of the Victorian bedroom was its lack of privacy, even among the wealthier classes. Servants moved in and out, tending to fires, delivering hot water, or cleaning. In aristocratic households, maids might help with undressing and dressing, making the bedroom less a private retreat and more a semi-public space. For the poor, privacy was almost unimaginable, with neighbors and lodgers sometimes sharing the same walls or even the same bed. Perhaps most revealing of all is how the bedroom mirrored the divide between classes. For the wealthy, it was a sanctuary, quiet and insulated from the world. For the middle classes, it was a symbol of modest respectability. For the poor, it was a crowded, often uncomfortable necessity. In every case, the bedroom shaped how Victorians slept, whether in warmth and quiet or in noise and cold. When we imagine the Victorian bedroom, we must see not only the heavy curtains and ornate beds of novels and period dramas, but also the cramped rooms of urban slums, where the air was thick, the bedding thin, and sleep a fragile thing. Both extremes existed side by side, revealing the vast inequality of the age. And so, the Victorian bedroom was more than a place to rest. It was a stage upon which health, class, morality, and even identity played out. To step into one is to glimpse the values of a society that saw sleep not as simple rest, but as a reflection of who you were and what you might become. If the Victorian bedroom set the stage, then the bed itself was the centerpiece of the drama of sleep. It was more than furniture. It was a symbol of class, comfort, morality, and even health. To look at what Victorians slept on is to understand much about how they lived, how they divided themselves by wealth, and how they thought about rest. For the wealthy, beds were grand objects, designed to impress as much as to comfort. Carved wooden frames, often mahogany or oak, rose high above the floor. Some were four-posters, draped with heavy curtains that could be drawn for warmth and privacy. Others featured canopies and elaborate headboards. These beds were dressed with multiple layers, a mattress stuffed with horsehair or feathers, topped with additional feather beds, sheets of fine linen, woolen blankets, and quilted counterpanes. The weight of so many coverings pressed down heavily, but for Victorians, that heaviness was a comfort, a shield against drafts and illness. Bed curtains served multiple purposes. They helped keep in warmth on cold nights, blocked out light, and created a sense of enclosure. They also gave the sleeper privacy, even in large households where servants might enter unannounced. Within the cocoon of curtains and blankets, the wealthy Victorian created a world of warmth and security. The middle classes aspired to similar comfort, though on a smaller scale. Iron bedsteads became popular in the 19th century, praised for their sturdiness and for being less likely to harbor insects than wooden frames. Mattresses might be filled with wool or horsehair, layered with linen sheets and blankets. Quilts or counterpanes added decoration, often in patterns of floral or geometric design. While less extravagant than aristocratic beds, middle-class beds still emphasized respectability, neatness, and comfort. For the poor, however, beds were often a luxury. Many families slept on straw mattresses, simple sacks stuffed with straw or chaff. These were rough, uncomfortable, and needed frequent replacement, as straw grew dirty, flattened, or infested with vermin. In the worst conditions, some slept directly on the floor, with only thin blankets for covering. Shared beds were common, with multiple children or even adults lying side by side for warmth. Privacy was impossible, comfort minimal. Reformers wrote anxiously about the conditions of poor bedding. They warned that damp, dirty straw spread disease, that overcrowding bred illness, and that lack of proper rest weakened both body and spirit. Charitable organizations sometimes distributed blankets or bedding, but poverty left many without adequate means for restful sleep. Beyond class, beds carried moral meaning. Guides insisted that neat, well-made beds reflected discipline and respectability. A properly arranged bed was seen as evidence of order in the household. Untidy or dirty beds suggested laziness or moral failing. Even the act of rising early to make one's bed was considered virtuous, tied to ideas of industry and self-control. Health advice also shaped bedding. Doctors urged families to avoid too many blankets, fearing that overheating weakened the body. They recommended mattresses of firm material, claiming they supported health better than soft feather beds. Ventilation was a constant theme. Reformers urged that bedding be aired out daily, sheets changed frequently, and windows open for fresh air, though fears of night air often conflicted with such advice. Pillows varied by class and taste. The wealthy enjoyed multiple pillows of down or feathers, while middle-class and working families might have only one each, stuffed with wool or chaff. Nightcaps were common, not only for warmth but to protect hairstyles. Heavy coverings, caps, and tightly enclosed beds made Victorian sleep a layered, insulated experience, far from the lighter bedding most of us use today. Another detail worth noting is the sheer weight of Victorian beds. Accounts describe blankets and quilts so heavy that children struggled to move beneath them. Some found comfort in the security of weight, while others felt stifled. Either way, the physical experience of Victorian sleep was shaped by the bulk and heft of bedding. For children, beds were often smaller, but no less symbolic. Cribs and small bedsteads reflected ideas about discipline and care. A child's bed was expected to be clean, modest, and functional. Overcrowding, however, meant that many children shared beds or slept alongside parents, blurring lines between care, necessity, and survival. Travelers encountered another layer of bedding culture in inns and boarding houses. Complaints about lumpy mattresses, damp sheets, and inadequate blankets were common in travel diaries. Even the wealthy, accustomed to comfort, found themselves restless in strange beds. Bedding was therefore both a comfort and a source of anxiety, a reminder of how essential sleep was to health and how fragile its conditions could be. To us, the Victorian bed may seem excessive on one end and inadequate on the other. But to them, it embodied values of order, morality, and survival. To lie down beneath layers of blankets was to submit not only to rest but to culture itself, to the weight of expectations, fears, and habits that shaped the night. In the end, the bed was never simply a place to sleep. It was a reflection of who you were, wealthy or poor, disciplined or disordered, healthy or sick. It was the centerpiece of the Victorian night, the object around which dreams, fears, and lives revolved. When we picture Victorian people at night, we often imagine them in long white gowns or tall pointed nightcaps. These images are not entirely wrong. Night clothing was a standard part of the sleep ritual, and it varied by class, age, and gender. What people wore to bed in Victorian Britain reveals not only comfort, but attitudes about health, modesty, and morality. For men, the staple garment was the nightshirt. Loose and long, often reaching below the knee, the nightshirt was made of cotton, linen, or flannel depending on the season. White was the most common color, symbolizing cleanliness and simplicity, though wealthier men sometimes wore decorated versions with subtle embroidery or colored piping. The nightshirt was practical, easy to launder, loose enough for comfort, and durable enough for repeated use. Some men wore undergarments beneath, while others wore only the shirt itself. Women wore night dresses or nightgowns, which were similar in cut but often more detailed. Long and flowing, they were made of light cotton for summer or heavier flannel for winter. Lace collars, ribbon ties, and embroidery at the sleeves or neckline distinguished wealthier versions. The nightgown was expected to be modest, high-necked, long-sleeved, and designed to cover the body even during sleep. In a culture obsessed with propriety, modesty extended even to the bedchamber. Over these garments, both men and women often wore nightcaps. Far from the caricature of tall pointed hats, nightcaps were usually soft, close-fitting pieces of fabric tied with a ribbon. They served a practical purpose, to keep the head warm in drafty rooms, but they also protected hairstyles, particularly for women. Caps for men were simple, while women's could be more elaborate, trimmed with lace or ribbon. Though mocked in later cartoons, nightcaps were genuinely useful in a world without central heating. Children's nightwear was simpler, but followed the same patterns. Nightshirts and nightdresses were common, made of sturdy cotton or flannel. Infants were often wrapped in long nightgowns that allowed room for growth. Like adults, children were kept modestly covered, reflecting parental concern with both warmth and morality. For the wealthy, night clothes could be surprisingly luxurious. Fine linens, silk ribbons, and carefully stitched embroidery turned simple garments into symbols of taste. Dressing for bed became another way to display refinement. For the middle class, nightwear was respectable but plain. For the poor, however, night clothes were often a luxury. Many slept in whatever garments they had, sometimes in underclothes or even daywear if no dedicated nightwear was available. Advice literature frequently addressed night clothes. Medical guides warned against garments that were too heavy or restrictive, urging that sleepwear should allow ventilation and free movement. At the same time, moralists stressed modesty, warning against indecent or careless clothing. The balance between health and morality shaped choices, even in the privacy of the bedroom. Nightwear was also linked to hygiene. Reformers encouraged families to wash nightclothes regularly, though for the poor this was not always possible. Dirty garments, they argued, spread disease and weakened the body. Clean, fresh linens were associated with moral virtue as well as physical health. Thus, changing into nightclothes was not just about comfort, it was about discipline and respectability. Another layer to Victorian nightwear was ritual. Dressing for bed was often a deliberate process, removing layers of day clothing, donning the nightshirt or gown, tying the cap, and settling into bed. For the wealthy, servants might assist with undressing, turning the act into a performance of routine. For the poor, it was simpler but still ritualized. The change of clothes marked a change of state, from day to night, from work to rest. We might also think of how night clothes shaped intimacy. For married couples, sleepwear reflected both modesty and closeness. While propriety demanded coverage, within the private world of marriage, nightgowns and nightshirts became garments of intimacy, associated with closeness and family life. The image of parents in their nightclothes, children tucked into bed nearby, captures the domestic rhythms of Victorian nights. Travel added another dimension. Boarding houses and inns expected guests to appear respectably dressed, even in nightwear, if emergencies arose. Diaries sometimes note embarrassment at being seen in nightclothes during fires or sudden disturbances. Nightwear, then, had a public element too, a reminder that even sleep did not erase the demands of respectability. Cartoons and illustrations from the period often mocked nightcaps and nightshirts, portraying them as symbols of old-fashioned fussiness. Yet their widespread use shows they were taken seriously. The combination of warmth, modesty, and health made nightwear an essential part of Victorian life. In the end, Victorian night clothes were about more than fabric. They reflected the values of the time: modesty, discipline, class, and health. Whether a silk-trimmed gown in a wealthy household or a plain cotton nightshirt in a worker's lodging, nightwear carried meaning. To dress for bed was not simply to prepare for rest, but to align oneself with the expectations of society, even in sleep. When we think of night today, it is rarely truly dark. Street lamps glow outside our windows, bedside lights stand within reach, and electricity pushes back the shadows. But in Victorian Britain, darkness was still a powerful force. Night fell quickly, and with it came a world of flickering flames, quiet fears, and deep shadows. The way Victorians lit their nights, with candles, lamps, and gaslight, shaped how they slept, how they dreamed, and how they imagined the dangers of the dark. For centuries, candles had been the primary source of light after sunset. By the 19th century, they remained common in many homes, though their quality and quantity varied by class. The wealthy used candles made from wax, which burned brightly and cleanly, producing little smoke or smell. The middle and working classes often relied on tallow candles made from animal fat. These were cheaper but gave off a smoky, greasy odor and often sputtered. A poor quality candle could fill a room with unpleasant fumes, stain walls, and irritate lungs. Yet for many, it was all they could afford. Candles were more than just light. They shaped the rhythm of life. To burn too many was wasteful, and so families rationed them carefully. Children might be put to bed early, not only for discipline but to save candlelight. Work, reading, or sewing by candlelight strained the eyes, and reformers warned against excessive nighttime activity. In poorer households, one candle might serve an entire family, its faint glow guiding multiple tasks before bedtime. Alongside candles, oil lamps also continued in use. These lamps, fueled by whale oil or vegetable oils, gave steadier light than candles and were often placed on tables or desks. Glass chimneys protected the flame and increased brightness. Yet oil lamps carried risks. They could tip over, spilling flammable liquid, or emit smoke if poorly maintained. Many a Victorian fire began with an overturned lamp. Still, for those who could afford them, oil lamps extended the evening, allowing reading, writing, and conversation to continue after dark. The great innovation of the 19th century, however, was gaslight. Introduced first in cities, gas lamps illuminated streets, theaters, shops, and eventually private homes. For the wealthy, gas fittings in bedrooms or parlors provided brilliant light at the turn of a valve. Gaslight transformed the appearance of interiors. Mirrors reflected its glow, chandeliers sparkled, and rooms shone with unprecedented brightness. Writers of the time often described the dazzling effect of gaslit spaces, comparing them to daylight itself. But gaslight carried dangers. The threat of leaks was constant. Invisible fumes could accumulate, poisoning those who breathed them. Explosions sometimes occurred when fittings failed. Doctors warned that gaslight dried the air and irritated lungs, making it unfit for children and invalids. Some reformers even claimed that gaslight disrupted sleep by overstimulating the senses and extending hours of activity. Families were advised to extinguish gas jets before bed, lest they suffocate in their sleep. In working-class homes, gas was slower to arrive, and many continued to rely on candles or oil lamps well into the century. Even where gas was available, its cost discouraged overuse. For many, darkness still ruled the night. Families retired early, and activities ceased once daylight faded. The rhythm of day and night was dictated less by choice than by necessity. What unites all these forms of light is how precarious they were. A candle might sputter out in a draft. A lamp might smoke or fall. A gas fitting might leak unseen. Darkness was never far away. To live in a Victorian bedroom was to live with flickering, uncertain light, and with the deep shadows it cast. This uncertainty shaped Victorian imagination. Darkness was feared as a breeding ground for illness, crime, and spirits. The phrase night air carried sinister weight, with many believing that drafts after sunset spread disease. Superstitions about ghosts and apparitions flourished in dimly lit rooms. Children were warned not to stare too long into shadows. Even adults confessed unease when extinguishing the last candle and plunging a room into total blackness. The act of going to bed was therefore tied to rituals of light. Families extinguished candles carefully, often leaving one burning low in a hallway or chamber for safety. Bedtime prayers were said by candlelight, shadows dancing across walls. Some households used rushlights, long strips of dried rush dipped in tallow, which burned slowly through the night, providing faint comfort to those who feared total darkness. Others relied on glowing embers in the hearth, the faint red light casting a reassuring presence across the room. We should also note how light was linked to class. The wealthy could afford multiple lamps, chandeliers, or gas fittings, turning night into a continuation of day. Their evenings stretched late, filled with reading, music, and conversation. The poor, limited by cost, lived more closely with darkness. Their nights ended sooner, their activities shaped by the fading of natural light. To walk through a Victorian city was to see both extremes: gaslit boulevards glittering with brightness and backstreets plunged in shadow. Travelers, too, felt the weight of light and darkness. In country inns, candles were scarce, and visitors often wrote of their discomfort in dim, smoky rooms. In cities, boarding houses lit by gas gave a sense of modernity, but carried the same risks of fumes. Sleep was always shaped by the balance between illumination and shadow, safety and danger. To us, accustomed to steady electric light, this world of flickering flames may seem fragile, even unsettling. Yet for Victorians, it was ordinary. They lived with shadows, with sudden darkness, with the constant need to tend flames. Light was precious, fleeting, and never guaranteed. In the end, Victorian nights were defined by the dance of flame and shadow. Candles glowed, lamps flickered, gaslight hissed, and then all went dark. Sleep came not in brightly lit comfort, but in the embrace of uncertainty, with only the faint glow of embers or the memory of light to keep fear at bay. To close one's eyes in such a world was not only to rest, but to surrender to darkness, a darkness that was never complete, never safe, but always alive with flicker, whisper, and possibility. Today we often speak of sleep as if it were one long, unbroken stretch. We assume that 8 hours of rest, taken in a single block, is both natural and universal. Yet for much of history, including the Victorian era, people often slept in a very different pattern. Historians call it segmented sleep, or the two sleeps theory. For Victorians, the night was divided into a first sleep and a second sleep, with a waking period in between. Evidence of this pattern can be found in diaries, medical texts, and literature of the time. People frequently referred to their first sleep as if it were a common phrase, not requiring explanation. After several hours of slumber, they would awaken naturally, often around midnight, and remain awake for 1 or 2 hours. They would then return to bed for a second sleep, which lasted until morning. This rhythm, so unusual to us today, was ordinary to them. During the waking interval, people did not lie restlessly waiting for sleep to return. Instead, they engaged in quiet activities. Some prayed or read devotional texts, believing that the stillness of midnight was the perfect time for reflection. Others wrote letters or read by candlelight. In rural areas, people sometimes used the interval for small tasks, tending to fires, checking on animals, or preparing food for the next day. In towns, neighbors might even visit one another briefly, exchanging words in the hushed hours of the night. Intimacy also found a place in these waking intervals. Married couples often used the time between sleeps for conversation or closeness, free from the busyness of the day. The stillness of midnight provided privacy and quiet that daylight rarely allowed. Diaries occasionally hint at this, describing the interval as a time for companionship or union, spoken of discreetly but clearly understood. Medical writers of the era sometimes recommended segmented sleep as beneficial. They claimed that waking in the middle of the night allowed the body to adjust, the mind to settle, and digestion to proceed more easily. Others warned that broken sleep might cause weakness or nervous strain, reflecting the Victorian tendency to view health through moral as well as physical lenses. Still, the persistence of two sleeps across different classes suggests it was less a problem than a pattern, one deeply embedded in daily life. The Industrial Revolution, however, began to challenge this rhythm. With factories demanding long, regulated hours and gaslight extending evenings, continuous sleep gradually became more common. Urban workers, exhausted by shifts, often collapsed into bed for what rest they could manage, without the luxury of waking leisurely in the middle of the night. Middle-class reformers, too, began to speak of sound, unbroken sleep as the ideal, linking it with discipline, efficiency, and modern progress. The two sleeps pattern slowly faded, but traces of it remained well into the Victorian period. Literature of the 19th century preserves glimpses of this practice. Characters speak of rising after their first sleep to stoke fires, read letters, or walk briefly. Ghost stories often exploit the midnight waking period, setting their scenes in those shadowy hours when people were alert but vulnerable. The idea of midnight musings, or the witching hour, grew from real experience. Countless men and women awake in their homes, wandering between dreams. For the poor, segmented sleep often blended with necessity. Overcrowded rooms, noise, and irregular work schedules broke the night naturally. Parents might wake to soothe children, lodgers stirred with movement, or neighbors' sounds carried through thin walls. First sleep and second sleep were less ritual than survival, the unavoidable rhythm of lives lived in close quarters. For the wealthy, by contrast, the waking interval could be leisurely. Surrounded by warmth, privacy, and abundance of candles, they could use the time for reading, prayer, or even correspondence. The midnight hours became extensions of the day, periods of quiet productivity or reflection framed by rest. What is striking is how normal this was. People expected to wake in the night. They did not view it as insomnia, but as part of the natural cycle of rest. Sleep was flexible, adaptive, and woven into the larger fabric of life. Night was not simply a pause between days, but a time with its own structure. First sleep, waking interval, second sleep. The fading of this pattern tells us something about modernity. The rise of industrial schedules, artificial light, and new ideas about discipline reshaped even our most intimate rhythms. Sleep was streamlined, regularized, made efficient like work itself. Yet in the Victorian night, we glimpse a world where rest was slower, more fragmented, but perhaps also more human. To imagine it is to picture a family lying down in the glow of candlelight, sinking into slumber. Hours later, they stir, rise, whisper prayers, stoke the fire, share quiet words. The house hums with faint life at midnight, then sinks again into silence as the second sleep begins. Morning comes, not after one long dream, but after two. The two sleeps remind us that what we consider natural is often cultural. Victorians slept differently not because their bodies were different, but because their world was. Darkness, silence, and custom shaped their nights, dividing sleep into chapters. To rest in two parts was to live in harmony with shadows and with time itself. And so, as we lie down today expecting one long stretch of rest, we might remember the Victorians, and their first sleep, their waking hour, and their second. Their nights remind us that even something as ordinary as sleep has a history, a story shaped by the needs, fears, and habits of its time. Sleep in Victorian Britain was never simply about closing one's eyes. Like nearly everything else in that society, it was shaped by class. Where you slept, how you slept, and even how long you slept depended greatly on whether you were wealthy, modestly comfortable, or desperately poor. The contrasts were striking. Sleep itself became a reflection of inequality. For the upper classes, sleep was part of a life cushioned by comfort. Wealthy families enjoyed large homes where bedrooms were spacious, private, and quiet. Feather mattresses, polished bedsteads, and layers of blankets kept the cold away. Servants prepared rooms, warm sheets with bedpans of hot coals, and drew curtains against drafts. Gaslight allowed late evenings of conversation, reading, or music before retiring. For the wealthy, sleep was framed as a restorative luxury, taken in surroundings designed to maximize ease. Doctors and writers of the period often catered to these readers. Medical guides spoke of the importance of sleep for health, advising the wealthy to rest at regular hours, avoid late suppers, and maintain fresh air in their bedrooms. Such advice assumed conditions that only the privileged could afford: multiple rooms, reliable warmth, and clean bedding. For the rich, sleep was not simply rest, but part of a lifestyle of order, discipline, and moral uprightness. The middle class occupied a different position. Their homes were smaller, often in bustling towns where noise seeped through thin walls and narrow streets. Bedrooms might be shared by siblings or crowded with furniture. Bedding was respectable but less lavish: mattresses of horsehair or wool, sheets of cotton or linen, and a handful of blankets. Iron bedsteads became popular, praised for cleanliness and affordability. Gaslight or oil lamps might be present, but often candles remained the norm. For the middle classes, sleep was respectable but not luxurious. It reflected values of thrift and propriety. Bedrooms were to be kept neat and orderly, and early rising was praised as virtuous. Reform literature aimed at this group often linked proper sleep with moral strength. A tidy bed, a disciplined routine, and early rising became marks of character. In this way, sleep was moralized, transformed into evidence of self-control and respectability. The working class, however, lived a different reality. Overcrowding was common, especially in rapidly growing industrial cities. Families often shared single rooms, and boarders sometimes joined them for extra income. Privacy was non-existent. Parents, children, and sometimes unrelated adults all slept together in cramped conditions. Straw mattresses or rough wooden frames served as beds, covered with thin blankets or even coats when bedding was scarce. The cold of winter nights bit sharply, and many went to bed wearing much of their day clothing simply for warmth. Noise was another burden of working-class sleep. Thin walls and shared spaces meant that neighbors' voices, footsteps, or arguments carried easily. In factories and industrial towns, shift work disrupted rhythms. Men and women returned home at irregular hours, disturbing others. The working poor often lived next to stables, workshops, or noisy streets, where sleep was broken by sound. Rest was fragile, easily stolen by labor or environment. For the poorest, sleep could be harsher still. In lodging houses or workhouses, beds were shared with strangers. Sometimes wooden benches or bare floors had to suffice. Disease spread easily in such conditions, and reformers wrote anxiously about the connection between poor sleep and poor health. Campaigns for better housing often highlighted the misery of sleeplessness in overcrowded rooms. Class not only determined comfort, but also shaped time. The wealthy could afford to sleep longer, rising at leisure. The middle classes prided themselves on rising early to demonstrate discipline. The poor, bound to the clock of the factory or workshop, often rose before dawn and collapsed late at night. Sleep was shortened, fragmented, and dictated by necessity. Fatigue became part of daily life. Cultural representations reflected these divides. Novels by writers such as Dickens often highlighted the misery of working-class lodgings, where restless nights mirrored social despair. By contrast, depictions of wealthy bedrooms emphasized luxury, portraying them as sanctuaries of calm. These contrasts were not exaggerated. They were lived realities, visible to anyone who walked the streets of London, Manchester, or Birmingham, passing from brightly lit houses into dim alleys filled with crowded rooms. Reformers and social investigators saw sleep as a moral and social issue. Reports on housing described the dangers of overcrowded bedrooms, linking them to disease and vice. Campaigns for improved housing were partly campaigns for better sleep, for beds not shared by too many, for rooms with ventilation, for spaces where families might rest in decency. Sleep was recognized, even then, as essential to health and morality. Yet despite these divides, sleep still carried universality. Whether rich or poor, people sought rest. They arranged what comfort they could, shared warmth when necessary, and followed the rhythms of night. A child in a crowded room dreamed no less vividly than a child in a spacious nursery. A laborer, collapsed after a long shift, found sleep as deeply as a gentleman in feathered comfort. Sleep, unequal as its conditions were, remained the most human of needs. The story of Victorian sleep, then, is also the story of Victorian society. The bed was not only a piece of furniture, but a symbol of class, wealth, and morality. For the rich, it was luxury. For the middle classes, it was respectability. For the poor, it was survival. Each night, as darkness fell, these differences shaped how Britain slept and how it dreamed. To understand Victorian nights, we must pause to look at how children slept. Childhood in the 19th century was marked by discipline, expectation, and routines that reflected not only family values, but also the social concerns of the age. How children went to bed, where they lay down, and how much rest they were allowed tells us much about the Victorian idea of upbringing. In wealthier households, nurseries and children's bedrooms were common. Large homes often had entire floors or wings dedicated to the young. Rooms were furnished with small bedsteads, cribs, or cots, often simple in style but solid in construction. Curtains kept out drafts, and thick quilts ensured warmth. Children were dressed in night dresses or nightshirts, often made of sturdy cotton. Nursemaids oversaw bedtime rituals, reading prayers, checking bedding, and making sure lamps were safely dimmed. In such homes, children's sleep was carefully supervised, framed as part of their moral and physical development. The middle classes followed similar patterns, though on a smaller scale. Children often shared bedrooms with siblings, sleeping in iron bedsteads or trundle beds that slid beneath larger ones during the day. Parents encouraged regular schedules, insisting on early bedtimes. Advice manuals for middle-class families often stressed the importance of sleep for growing bodies, warning against late hours or restless habits. Respectable families prided themselves on orderly nights, seeing them as evidence of discipline. For working-class children, however, sleep was more precarious. Overcrowding meant that children often shared beds, sometimes 3 or 4 to a mattress, or slept on floors padded with straw. Privacy was non-existent. The cries of infants mingled with the snores of adults, and bedtime was often dictated less by routine than by exhaustion. A child might fall asleep while parents or siblings continued work or conversation in the same room. The rhythm of industrial labor shaped even the youngest lives. Despite these differences, one thread united Victorian children across classes: the moral weight attached to their sleep. Reformers, educators, and medical writers constantly reminded parents that children must go to bed early. Late nights were condemned as harmful to health and corrupting to morals. Children were seen as impressionable, and early rising was tied to virtues of diligence and obedience. To oversleep was to risk laziness, and to resist bedtime was to test authority. Bedtime rituals often carried moral lessons. Prayers before bed were common, even in modest homes. Parents and nursemaids taught children to kneel, recite verses, and ask for protection through the night. Fear of death in sleep was not uncommon, and prayers often included pleas for safe awakening. Hymns and gentle songs accompanied bedtime, lulling children into rest while reinforcing faith. Superstitions also colored childhood nights. Parents sometimes told stories of spirits or fairies that would punish disobedient children who resisted sleep. Shadows in the corner of a poorly lit room could be transformed into cautionary tales. These stories, while frightening, reinforced discipline and kept children in their beds. Yet they also filled young imaginations with vivid images, shaping dreams and fears alike. Illness was another concern. Reformers worried about the effects of damp rooms, poor bedding, and stale air on children's health. Medical guides insisted on fresh air, regular washing of sheets, and the use of proper night clothing. The wealthy followed such advice with ease, but the poor often could not. Reports of children sleeping without sufficient blankets, shivering through winters, or sharing beds with sick relatives highlight the harsh realities of working-class life. For many children, school added another dimension. Boarding schools imposed strict schedules, with bells marking bedtime and rising. Dormitories held rows of identical beds, and silence was enforced after lights were extinguished. Teachers and matrons patrolled the halls, ensuring order. Sleep here was less about comfort and more about discipline, one more tool for shaping obedient, industrious citizens. Leisure also affected children's sleep. In wealthier homes, evenings might include reading, music, or games before bed. In poorer households, children sometimes worked late, helping parents with chores, mending clothes, or even contributing to small-scale home industries. The notion of childhood as a time of leisure and early rest was not universal. For many, especially in industrial towns, fatigue came not from play but from labor. The symbolism of children's sleep stretched beyond the home. Writers often used it as a metaphor for innocence, vulnerability, or hope. Paintings depicted angelic children in cribs, wrapped in soft quilts. Literature described young sleepers as embodiments of purity. Yet these images often contrasted starkly with the lived reality of poor children crowded into unhealthy rooms. The Victorian fascination with childhood sleep reveals both nostalgia for innocence and anxiety about social conditions. What strikes us most today is how structured children's nights were. Bedtime was rarely flexible. It was a matter of principle, woven into ideas about health, morality, and class. Whether in the calm order of a nursery, the rows of a boarding school dormitory, or the chaos of a one-room lodging, Victorian children went to bed under the weight of expectation. Their sleep was not simply biological, it was social, moral, and cultural. In the end, children's sleep tells us that the Victorian night was about more than rest. It was about shaping character, enforcing order, and preserving health. It was about discipline as much as dreams. And while the softness of a nursery bed and the hardness of a straw pallet were worlds apart, both carried the same message: To sleep well was to grow well, to rise early was to live rightly, and to dream was to step quietly into the future that society had already prepared. Victorians thought about sleep not only as a matter of comfort, but also as a matter of health. In a period when medicine was changing rapidly, with new discoveries colliding against old beliefs, advice about sleep became part of daily life. Doctors, reformers, and household guides all offered opinions on how, when, and where one should sleep in order to remain well. What seems obvious to us now was, in the Victorian age, wrapped in a mixture of science, superstition, and moral instruction. Medical writers frequently emphasized the importance of regular sleep. They warned against irregular hours, late nights, and excessive indulgence in entertainment. Sleep, they argued, was a restorative force necessary for both body and mind. A well-rested person was more productive, more virtuous, and more resistant to illness. By contrast, those who neglected sleep were said to risk nervous disorders, weakness, and even moral decline. The link between health and morality ran deep. One of the most common pieces of advice was to sleep with windows open for ventilation. Fresh air, reformers argued, was essential. They believed that closed rooms grew stale, breeding disease. Yet many families feared the so-called night air, believing it carried mists and vapors that caused illness. The tension between advice and fear meant that windows were often opened only a crack, or never at all. For the wealthy, high ceilings and multiple rooms made ventilation easier, while the poor often had little choice, sleeping in cramped quarters where fresh air was scarce. The position of the body during sleep also attracted attention. Some guides recommended lying on one's back to aid digestion and breathing, while others insisted side sleeping was best. Debates filled medical texts, each author certain of their position. Even the placement of the bed in a room was considered important. Beds were to be kept away from damp walls, drafts, or fireplaces, each believed to affect health in different ways. Another recurring theme was the need for early rising. Early to bed, early to rise, the familiar phrase was repeated endlessly. Rising early was said to strengthen health, improve discipline, and encourage productivity. To linger in bed was condemned as laziness, a weakness that endangered both body and character. Reformers linked oversleeping to vice, claiming that late risers became prone to idleness and ill health. Food and drink before bed also entered the conversation. Heavy suppers were discouraged, as doctors warned that indigestion disturbed rest. Alcohol, particularly gin and beer, was blamed for restless nights and ill health. Warm milk or light broths were sometimes recommended as gentle aids to sleep. Middle-class families absorbed this advice eagerly, shaping evening meals around the idea of preparing the body for rest. Children's health received particular attention. Manuals advised strict bedtimes, proper bedding, and fresh air for growing bodies. Overcrowded working-class housing, however, made such recommendations nearly impossible. Reformers frequently pointed to children sleeping in damp, unventilated rooms as evidence of social decay. Charitable organizations campaigned for better housing, linking health, morality, and the ability to sleep decently. The wealthy, meanwhile, embraced new medical products that promised better rest. Patent medicines advertised themselves as cures for sleeplessness, nervousness, or night terrors. Some contained opiates, others alcohol, often doing more harm than good. Yet they reflected growing anxieties about sleep and health. As the pace of modern life quickened, even the privileged worried about sleeplessness and its consequences. Doctors also warned against oversleeping. Too much rest, they said, weakened the body. Advice manuals suggested between 6 and 8 hours, though the exact number varied. Women were often told to sleep more, reflecting stereotypes about fragility, while men were urged to rise early and work. These prescriptions reveal less about biology and more about cultural expectations. Superstitions mixed with science in peculiar ways. Some families believed that sleeping with the head to the north promoted health, while others feared certain positions invited nightmares. Dream interpretation also blurred into medicine, with nightmares blamed on indigestion, fear, or even spirits. The night remained a place where rational science and irrational belief coexisted uneasily. In hospitals and institutions, sleep became part of treatment. Patients were encouraged to rest in clean, ventilated wards, though overcrowding often undermined this goal. Doctors noted the healing power of sleep, but they also struggled with its disturbances. Anxieties, noises, and pain made rest elusive. Efforts to create quiet, orderly wards reflected both medical and moral aims. For the poor, health and sleep were inseparable from poverty. Overcrowded, damp rooms bred disease, and lack of proper bedding weakened bodies already strained by labor. Reformers saw this clearly. Reports described how poor sleep deepened cycles of illness and exhaustion, leaving the poor less able to work, and therefore less able to improve their conditions. Sleep was both a necessity and a luxury, unevenly distributed across society. In the middle class, sleep became a marker of respectability. To follow medical advice, keep rooms clean, rise early, and maintain orderly routines was to demonstrate moral strength. To neglect these practices was to risk not only sickness but also social criticism. Sleep was personal, but it was also a public measure of discipline. By the late 19th century, scientific studies of sleep began to expand. Doctors wrote of nerves, circulation, and digestion, moving away from older fears of vapors and bad air. Yet even as science advanced, the cultural weight of morality remained. Sleep was still framed as both health and virtue, something that shaped not only the body but the character. Looking back, we see how Victorians tied sleep to health in ways that combined science, morality, and class. They worried about air, posture, meals, and rising times. They linked sleep to virtue, discipline, and the ability to contribute to society. Their advice was sometimes sensible, sometimes misguided, but always earnest. To close one's eyes in Victorian Britain was never just to rest. It was to follow a script of health, morality, and order. For the wealthy, this script was manageable, even comfortable. For the poor, it was an impossible ideal, clashing with the realities of overcrowded rooms and endless labor. In both cases, though sleep was seen as vital, not only for the body but for the soul. If sleep in Victorian Britain was bound up with health and morality, then dreams were bound up with meaning. To Victorians, dreams were never simply random images produced by the mind. They were signs, warnings, reflections of health, or even messages from the spiritual world. A bad dream might be blamed on indigestion, but it could just as easily be interpreted as an omen. Nightmares, in particular, carried weight, feared as both medical symptoms and supernatural visitations. Dream interpretation had a long history, stretching back to classical and medieval traditions. In the Victorian period, this tradition persisted. Popular books of dream interpretation were widely sold, offering long lists of symbols and their supposed meanings. To dream of water, for example, might suggest change or danger. To dream of teeth falling out might foretell illness or death. These guides were purchased by both middle and working-class readers, eager to make sense of the mysteries that played out each night behind closed eyes. But Victorians also lived in an age of science. Doctors and reformers tried to explain dreams in medical terms. They argued that indigestion, fever, or nervous strain caused disturbing visions. Heavy meals before bed were blamed for nightmares, while emotional turmoil during the day was said to produce restless dreams at night. Physicians described dreams as the brain processing impressions, stripped of reason and logic. Yet even these scientific explanations carried moral undertones. Gluttony, anxiety, and vice were linked to troubled sleep. Nightmares were a special source of fascination. Accounts from the period describe the sensation of being pressed upon by a heavy weight, unable to breathe or move. This condition, which we now call sleep paralysis, was then often attributed to supernatural forces. The night hag, or demon sitting on the chest, was a common image in folklore and art. Medical men offered explanations about nerves and digestion, but many ordinary people still believed such experiences to be encounters with spirits. Children's dreams were given particular attention. Reformers urged parents to keep children from frightening stories or images before bed, warning that such tales produced nightmares. Mothers were told to soothe children gently, ensuring that their dreams remained pure. Yet diaries and memoirs reveal that children often feared shadows, strange noises, and unsettling visions in the night. In crowded homes, these fears mingled with real dangers: the sound of rats, the groans of sick relatives, or the shouts of drunken neighbors. Religious meaning also shaped Victorian attitudes toward dreams. Many saw them as opportunities for divine communication. Dreams of angels or visions of heaven were taken as reassurance. Others feared dreams of death or darkness as warnings of sin. Clergy sometimes preached about the moral significance of dreams, urging congregations to examine their hearts when troubled by nightmares. The boundary between spiritual life and nightly visions was porous. Literature of the time reflected this fascination. Gothic novels filled their pages with dream sequences, where characters encountered specters or foreshadowed future tragedies. Ghost stories often blurred the line between dream and reality, leaving readers unsure whether events were supernatural or psychological. Poets described the dream world as a space of imagination, beauty, and terror. To read Victorian literature is to find countless references to the strange landscapes of sleep. For the wealthy, dreams were often recorded in journals, discussed at breakfast, and even analyzed in correspondence. The middle classes bought dream manuals and consulted them like dictionaries. For the poor, dreams were woven into oral culture, told as warnings or lessons, often with moral overtones. Across society, the dream was never dismissed as meaningless. It always said something, though opinions differed on what. Nightmares, in particular, troubled the Victorian mind. Medical texts described them as dangerous to health, warning that repeated bad dreams might weaken the nerves or disturb digestion. Parents feared that children tormented by nightmares would grow anxious or ill. Superstitions linked nightmares to witches or spirits, lingering beliefs that centuries of folklore had not erased. To awaken sweating and fearful in the middle of the night was, to many, a sign of more than bodily disorder. It was a sign of contact with forces unseen. Dreams also intersected with grief. Many Victorians recorded dreams of deceased loved ones, seeing them as visits from the dead. In a culture where mourning practices were elaborate and death was ever present, such dreams carried comfort. A dream of a lost child or spouse could be seen as a message, a sign of continued presence beyond the grave. This blending of dream and mourning reveals the depth of emotional investment Victorians placed in the world of sleep. Not all dreams were heavy with meaning. Some were seen as curiosities, amusing tales to be shared at the breakfast table. Newspapers occasionally published dream anecdotes, sometimes mocking them, sometimes reporting them earnestly. But whether trivial or profound, dreams were treated as a window into something beyond the ordinary. What strikes us today is how little Victorians dismissed. A bad dream could be blamed on supper, but it could also be seen as a warning of death. A pleasant dream could be a sign of health, but also a glimpse of heaven. They lived in a world where science, superstition, and spirituality overlapped. Dreams sat at the intersection of all three, impossible to ignore. To sleep in Victorian Britain was therefore never simply to rest. It was to enter a realm of potential meaning, a space where the body revealed its state, where the soul might be tested, where spirits might visit, and where grief might find expression. Nightmares pressed themselves onto the chest not only of the sleeper, but of the culture itself, reflecting anxieties about health, morality, and death. In the end, dreams and nightmares revealed the Victorian night as a place of both rest and unease. Behind closed curtains, in the flicker of dying candles, men, women, and children drifted into worlds both strange and significant. They awoke to tell of them, to fear them, to seek meaning in them. To the Victorians, sleep was never empty. It was full of signs, warnings, and whispers from the unseen. For the Victorians, the night was not simply a time of rest. It was a time of mystery, uncertainty, and fear. Darkness carried meanings that went far beyond the practical absence of light. To sleep at night was also to place oneself in a realm of superstition. Ghosts, witches, omens, and unseen forces were believed to move most freely when the sun had set. While science and reason were growing stronger in the 19th century, superstition still held a firm grip on the imagination of ordinary people. One of the most enduring fears was that of the night air. Even when medical reformers urged families to ventilate their bedrooms, many refused. They believed that air after dark carried mists, vapors, and invisible poisons. Entire generations were taught that to sleep with an open window was to invite sickness, perhaps even death. Stories circulated of families falling ill after a draft crept across the room. For the poor, whose housing was already damp and drafty, such fears compounded their discomfort. The fear of spirits was equally widespread. Many Victorians believed that the hours after midnight were especially dangerous. Ghosts were thought to wander then, freed from the boundaries of day. Tales of haunted houses and apparitions appearing in bedrooms filled popular literature. Newspapers often carried accounts of sightings, sometimes mocking, sometimes serious. For children especially, the night was a landscape of shadows alive with figures half imagined and half believed. Nightmares were often interpreted in supernatural terms. The sensation of sleep paralysis, in which a person wakes unable to move, was explained as the work of a night hag or spirit sitting on the chest. Medical men wrote of nerves and digestion, but many ordinary people clung to the older belief. Paintings and illustrations depicted the demon or hag crouched on a sleeper, capturing a fear that words alone could not. To wake breathless and paralyzed was to feel the presence of something beyond nature. Dreams, too, carried superstitious weight. A dream of death was thought to foreshadow an actual passing. To dream of teeth falling out was an omen of illness. To dream of a wedding foretold sorrow. Books of dream interpretation were widely sold, mixing folk wisdom with superstition. Even as doctors argued about the scientific causes of dreams, many Victorians turned to these manuals, treating them as guides to the future. Superstitions extended to the most ordinary aspects of night. Mirrors, for example, were often covered in bedrooms. People feared that spirits could enter or leave through them while one slept. To leave a mirror uncovered was to risk inviting ghosts into the room. Similarly, some households insisted that shoes must not be left pointing toward the bed, lest they guide spirits to the sleeper. Death and the night were closely linked. Many Victorians believed that death came most often in the small hours, when resistance was weakest. To watch by the bedside of a dying relative was to keep vigil not only against illness, but also against spirits waiting to carry the soul away. Candles were left burning, prayers were whispered, and silence was observed with solemn care. Children were often disciplined with superstition. Parents warned them that if they did not go to bed on time, spirits or witches would come. Shadows in the corner of the nursery were transformed into cautionary tales. These warnings served practical purposes, but they also kept alive traditions of fear. For many children, bedtime was as much about battling imagined dangers as about finding rest. Travelers recorded their own encounters with superstition. In rural inns, they sometimes found hosts reluctant to extinguish all candles, fearing that total darkness invited danger. In boarding houses, stories of ghosts in certain rooms circulated freely. Even educated visitors admitted to unease when lying awake in strange beds, listening to creaks and sighs in the timbers. The middle classes, priding themselves on reason, sometimes mocked such fears. Articles in magazines dismissed ghost stories as foolishness. Yet the same publications printed tales of haunted houses and unexplained events, feeding the fascination they claimed to scorn. Superstition, like the night itself, lingered in the corners, never fully banished. We must remember that this was also the age of spiritualism. Seances, mediums, and attempts to contact the dead were immensely popular, even among the educated. Parlors filled with people holding hands in the dark, waiting for knocks, whispers, or apparitions. While some saw this as entertainment, others took it very seriously. The Victorian night was therefore not only feared but also sought after, treated as a doorway to the unseen. Superstitions even entered the design of bedrooms. Beds were sometimes placed so that the head did not point toward a door, believed to invite death. Windows were kept shuttered, not only against cold but against spirits. Even the humble act of extinguishing a candle might be done with a whispered word, to ward off bad luck. In working-class districts, where death and disease were more common, superstitions gave shape to fears that were all too real. Families who had lost children or relatives often reported dreams, visions, or nightly visitations. For them, the line between grief and superstition was thin. The night was a place of both sorrow and memory, haunted not only by spirits but by loss. What all of this shows is that Victorian nights were heavy with meaning. To sleep was never to fall simply into unconsciousness. It was to step into a realm where air itself might carry sickness, where spirits might press upon the chest, where dreams foretold events, and where shadows concealed dangers. The night was not neutral. It was alive, charged with possibility and fear. Today we may dismiss such beliefs as superstition, but for the Victorians, they were part of ordinary life. To them, the night was not empty. It was full of presences, warnings, and meanings. To sleep was to risk encounter with all of these, even as it promised rest. When we imagine Victorian nights, we may think of heavy curtains, flickering lamps, and quiet houses settling into sleep. But for many people, silence was rare. Noise filled the night, the sound of neighbors, the creak of boards, the rattle of carriages, or the cries of animals. To fall asleep in Victorian Britain was often to do so in the company of sound, sometimes comforting, sometimes disturbing, but rarely absent. In wealthy homes, noise was more easily controlled. Large houses with thick walls, spacious gardens, and separate servants' quarters shielded families from much of the world outside. Bedrooms were placed away from the street, cushioned by layers of drapery and carpet. The muffled hush of luxury created an illusion of calm. Yet even here, sound intruded. Servants moved through halls, fires crackled, clocks chimed the hours, and carriage wheels echoed from distant roads. Silence was never absolute. The middle classes, living in smaller houses and closer to neighbors, experienced more of the night's chorus. Terraced homes shared walls, and thin construction carried sound from room to room. A baby crying next door, a quarrel in the street, or footsteps on stairs could disturb the household. Respectable families prided themselves on quiet order, yet their sleep was often shaped by the unavoidable presence of others living only a few feet away. For the working poor, noise was constant and often overwhelming. In overcrowded lodgings, several families might share the same building, with thin partitions offering little separation. Snores, coughs, and whispers carried easily through walls. Children stirred and cried, while adults came and went at irregular hours. In shared rooms, the movements of one person disturbed many. Sleep was fragmented, broken by the collective sounds of survival. Urban environments added further layers. Industrial towns rarely grew still. Factories clattered into the evening, whistles blew, and carts rattled down cobbled streets. Animals, horses, dogs, and even pigs contributed to the nighttime soundscape. Street vendors called out late, while public houses emptied into noisy throngs. In poorer districts, drunken arguments, songs, or brawls spilled into alleys. For many city dwellers, sleep was not accompanied by silence, but by a constant hum. Noise also carried moral weight. Reformers complained that working-class neighborhoods were too noisy, that families lacked discipline to maintain peace. Quiet, they argued, was a sign of respectability. Noise, by contrast, suggested disorder. Yet much of this judgment ignored the reality of overcrowding, poverty, and industrial life. Noise was not a choice, it was a condition. Night watchmen, constables, and reformers often wrote about the sounds of the night. They described streets alive with voices, songs drifting from taverns, and cries of street sellers finishing their trade. The clatter of iron-shod wheels and the clip of horse hooves echoed against brick walls, magnifying even small disturbances. Silence, when it came, was uncanny, a stillness broken easily by a cough, a knock, or a distant bell. Country nights were quieter, though not silent. The calls of owls, the barking of dogs, and the crowing of roosters created their own rhythms. Farmers rose early, and their movements stirred neighbors. Villages were bound by sound just as cities were, though the volume was lower. For rural Victorians, the noise of the natural world blended with the sounds of human life, a mixture less harsh but still ever present. For children, nighttime sounds were often terrifying. In dark rooms lit only by faint candlelight, every creak of wood or rustle of fabric seemed magnified. Parents soothed them with reassurances, but fear of burglars, ghosts, or unseen animals was common. For adults, too, noise was a source of unease. A sudden knock at the door after midnight was rarely good news. In literature, unexpected sounds became a hallmark of suspense, signaling danger or revelation. We should remember, too, that many Victorians lived in homes without insulation, where wind whistled through cracks and rain tapped against thin roofs. Such natural sounds blended with human noise, creating nights alive with shifting textures. To modern ears, accustomed to sealed windows and artificial quiet, the Victorian night would seem startlingly alive. At times, noise could be communal. Neighbors heard one another not only in quarrels, but in shared laughter, songs, and celebrations. Weddings, wakes, and festivals often extended into the night, and the sounds of joy or mourning passed freely through walls. Sleep was postponed or disturbed, but such disturbances reinforced community ties. To live in close quarters was to live with the rhythms of others, for better and for worse. Reformers sometimes sought to impose order on the night. Campaigns against drunkenness, disorderly houses, and late-opening taverns were partly campaigns for quiet. Respectable citizens demanded peace in their neighborhoods, and laws attempted to regulate sound. Yet enforcement was uneven, and for many working-class districts, noise remained a fact of life. Even in wealthier settings, noise could intrude. Diaries of the gentry sometimes mention restless nights disturbed by barking dogs, storms shaking windows, or servants rising early. Sleep was precious, and any disruption was keenly felt. The complaints of the wealthy about noise remind us that even comfort could not guarantee silence. Noise shaped not only how Victorians slept, but also how they dreamed. Restless nights filled with sounds of quarrels or songs may have influenced the content of dreams, feeding anxieties or mirroring joys. To close one's eyes was not to escape sound, but to absorb it, consciously or not. The hum of the neighborhood, the rattle of a passing cart, or the muffled cry of a child became part of the fabric of rest. In the end, Victorian nights were never truly silent. They were filled with layers of sound, each reflecting the conditions of class, place, and community. For the wealthy, muffled quiet framed by servants and gardens. For the middle class, the steady intrusion of neighbors through shared walls. For the poor, the relentless clamor of overcrowding and urban life. Noise was as much a part of the night as darkness itself. To imagine Victorian sleep, then, is to imagine a world where silence was rare. The night was alive, filled with voices, wheels, footsteps, and whispers. Sleep came not in solitude but in company, shaped always by the presence of others. Victorian life was not confined to the home. People traveled for business, for leisure, and for necessity. With travel came the problem of sleep in unfamiliar places: hotels, inns, and boarding houses. These settings reveal much about Victorian attitudes toward rest. They show the contrast between luxury and discomfort, between the wealthy traveler and the working poor in search of a bed. To understand sleep away from home is to see another layer of the 19th century night. For the wealthy, travel could be surprisingly comfortable. Grand hotels in cities like London, Bath, and Edinburgh offered spacious rooms, feather mattresses, and attentive staff. Guests could summon hot water, dine late, and retire to private chambers warmed by fires. Bedrooms were decorated with carpets, curtains, and mirrors, designed to reassure travelers that they carried the comforts of home with them. Such hotels catered to a clientele who expected rest to be as refined abroad as it was in their own houses. But even in these establishments, doubts lingered. Travelers often wrote of restless nights in unfamiliar beds. The sounds of corridors, the comings and goings of other guests, and the strangeness of surroundings disturbed their sleep. Complaints about hard mattresses, damp sheets, or smoky lamps filled travel diaries. For all their grandeur, hotels could not always deliver the deep rest that came from familiarity. Boarding houses offered a middle-class alternative. These lodgings, often run by widows or families seeking extra income, provided rooms at modest prices. Guests shared meals and sometimes shared facilities. Bedrooms were smaller and more plainly furnished than those of hotels. Iron bedsteads, simple washstands, and modest quilts were typical. Respectable boarding houses sought to maintain order and quiet, yet neighbors' sounds carried easily, and privacy was limited. Travelers accepted such conditions as the cost of economy. For the working classes, travel meant rougher accommodations. Cheap lodging houses, sometimes called doss houses, offered beds at low prices. Conditions varied widely. Some provided narrow beds in crowded rooms, with thin blankets and little privacy. Others offered only benches or floors for sleeping. Overcrowding was common, and disease spread easily in such environments. Reformers wrote angrily about the misery of these lodgings, describing them as unfit for decent rest. Yet for itinerant workers, sailors, or the unemployed, such places were often the only option. Travelers by rail or coach faced other challenges. Long journeys often forced sleep in cramped conditions. Passengers dozed sitting upright, heads nodding, surrounded by strangers. Diaries described the exhaustion of overnight travel, the jolting of carriages, and the cold drafts that crept in through poorly sealed windows. The romance of travel was often tempered by the discomfort of sleep snatched in motion. We must also remember that Victorians traveled with different expectations of time. Journeys were slower and delays common. A night in a strange bed was often unavoidable, part of the rhythm of moving from place to place. Letters and memoirs reveal how travelers weighed the quality of their rest against the success of their journeys. A poor night's sleep could sour an entire trip. Hotels and inns also carried reputations. Some were famed for comfort and respectability, while others were notorious for noise, theft, or immorality. Choosing where to sleep was therefore a matter not only of comfort, but of social standing. Respectable travelers avoided dubious establishments, while poorer ones had little choice. In this way, the culture of sleep outside the home mirrored the divisions of class present within it. Women traveling alone faced particular scrutiny. A lady staying in a hotel or boarding house was expected to choose carefully, lest her reputation be compromised. Diaries of women travelers often note their relief at finding respectable accommodations. The act of sleeping away from home carried risks not only of discomfort, but of social judgment. Lighting and heating added further complications. Guests worried about fires in crowded inns, about suffocation from gaslight, or about the chill of unheated rooms. The familiar routines of the home, extinguishing a candle, drawing curtains, ensuring fresh air, were more difficult in strange places. Sleep away from home was never simply sleep, it was an exercise in adaptation. Even the wealthy could not escape unease. Letters described noblemen and ladies fretting over bedbugs, suspicious of sheets, or longing for their own pillows. These anxieties remind us that sleep, no matter how luxurious, was fragile when taken in strange surroundings. For the poor, the experience was harsher still. Reformers reported men sleeping side by side in filthy lodging houses, children huddled under coats, and women forced to share space with strangers. Sleep in such places was unsafe, shallow, and frequently interrupted. Travelers without means often emerged more exhausted than before. The contrast is striking. At the top, hotels with chandeliers and private fires. In the middle, boarding houses with modest but respectable rooms. At the bottom, lodging houses where sleep was reduced to survival. Yet all were bound by the same necessity. The travelers need to close their eyes in an unfamiliar bed. What unites these accounts is a sense of vulnerability. To sleep away from home was to surrender control. The traveler trusted strangers with their safety, their belongings, and their rest. Whether in luxury or poverty, the act of lying down in a strange place carried unease. Sleep was always lighter, dreams more troubled, and mornings greeted with mixed relief and fatigue. In the end, Victorian travel reminds us that rest was never guaranteed. It depended on class, on means, and on luck. A fine hotel could disappoint, a poor lodging could degrade, yet both were part of the landscape of sleep. To journey in the 19th century was to accept not only the slowness of travel, but also the uncertainty of the night. In Victorian Britain, work shaped nearly every aspect of life, and sleep was no exception. The rhythms of labor, whether in fields, factories, or offices, dictated when people went to bed, how long they slept, and how deeply they rested. For many, sleep was not a choice or a luxury, but a fragile necessity stolen from the hours left over after work. To understand Victorian nights, we must therefore examine how labor and rest intertwined. The Industrial Revolution created new patterns of time. Factories and workshops demanded regular hours with bells, whistles, or clocks enforcing punctuality. For laborers, this meant rising before dawn, trudging through streets or fields, and working long shifts, often lasting 12 to 16 hours. Sleep was shortened to fit around these demands. For men, women, and even children employed in industry, the night was compressed, and rest became secondary to production. Reports from reformers described children stumbling to work before sunrise, still half asleep, their nights cut short by the factory bell. Entire families adapted their rhythms to industrial schedules, with meals, chores, and bedtimes all dictated by the demands of work. Sleep was fragmented, shallow, and often inadequate. Fatigue was a constant companion. Reform campaigns for shorter hours were, in part, campaigns for more rest. For the middle classes, work created different pressures. Clerks, shopkeepers, and professionals worked long days, but their hours were more regular. They could expect to sleep at night, though anxieties about business, finances, or social status often intruded. Medical guides warned of nervous sleeplessness, a condition blamed on overwork and mental strain. Middle-class families were urged to maintain discipline, to go to bed early, rise early, and keep regular schedules that balanced work and rest. The wealthy, by contrast, were insulated from such pressures. Their work, if it could be called that, was often managerial or social. Servants maintained households, allowing their employers to retire at leisure. Yet even among the upper classes, anxieties about work and responsibility sometimes disturbed rest. Letters and diaries record nights of worry about estates, politics, or investments. Sleep, though more comfortable, was still vulnerable to the demands of responsibility. Night work added another layer to Victorian sleep. Watchmen, bakers, printers, and transport workers labored through the dark hours, reversing the usual cycle of rest. For these men and women, sleep came during the day, in rooms often noisy and poorly lit. Their bodies resisted, their health suffered, and reformers warned of the dangers of disrupted rhythms. Night work, though essential, was seen as unnatural and unhealthy. Domestic servants also lived with irregular sleep. They rose before their employers to prepare fires, carry water, or make breakfast. They retired late after cleaning and tidying. Servants' quarters were often cramped, cold, or shared, offering little comfort. Sleep for them was short and easily broken by bells summoning their service. The luxury of wealthy households was built, in part, upon the exhaustion of servants deprived of rest. Seamen and soldiers experienced even harsher conditions. Watches at sea or on campaign divided nights into shifts, forcing men to sleep in rotations. Hammocks swung in crowded quarters, or bedrolls lay on damp ground. Noise, cold, and danger surrounded them. Diaries of sailors described constant fatigue, their rest always uncertain. For such men, sleep was not restorative but survival, seized whenever possible. The link between work and sleep was also moralized. Reformers praised early rising as a sign of diligence and condemned idleness as sinful. To sleep late was to waste daylight and betray one's duties. Proverbs, sermons, and advice manuals reinforced this message. Even when exhausted, workers were expected to rise promptly, their worth measured in discipline. Sleep was judged not only by health but by morality. Workhouses, where the poor sought relief, reflected this harsh attitude. Inmates were given narrow beds in crowded dormitories and woken early for labor. Sleep was regulated strictly, part of a system designed to enforce order and productivity. Rest was not a right but a ration, granted and controlled by authority. Yet despite these demands, people found ways to adapt. Afternoon naps, though not widely encouraged, were sometimes taken by workers during breaks. Families in rural areas balanced field labor with seasonal rhythms, sleeping longer in winter and shorter in summer. Even in factories, workers occasionally nodded off at their posts, punished if caught but demonstrating the body's refusal to abandon rest entirely. For the middle classes, anxieties about work often translated into concerns about sleep quality. Medical advertisements promised cures for sleeplessness caused by nerves, offering tonics, powders, or special mattresses. The rise of industrial and clerical work created new forms of fatigue, less physical but more mental. Sleeplessness became a modern complaint, evidence of progress but also of its costs. Leisure, too, was tied to work. For those with more means, evenings stretched longer, filled with reading, music, or visits. Sleep began later, though comfort made up for lost hours. For the poor, however, leisure was scarce, and work dictated every hour. Their nights were short, their mornings early, their sleep fragmented by necessity. What emerges is a picture of inequality. The wealthy rested when they wished. The middle classes disciplined themselves according to ideals of respectability. The poor surrendered their nights to factories, workshops, and households that consumed their energy. Sleep was as much a marker of class as clothing or speech. In the end, Victorian work left deep marks on Victorian nights. Rest was shaped, shortened, and judged according to labor. To close one's eyes was to retreat from exhaustion, but also to prepare for more work ahead. For many, sleep was less a gentle respite than a brief pause before the demands of labor began again.